When asked the question, who proposed the theory of evolution, the answer that most people would give would be the Shrewsbury-born naturalist Charles Darwin. Whilst this is absolutely correct and he was responsible for penning and popularising the theory, credit is given less so to Alfred Russel Wallace, a fellow naturalist born in Llanbaddock, South Wales, who individually developed a theory of evolution by natural selection. So why did Wallace receive less credit than Darwin in spite of all of his hard work? Well, that is the question that I aim to answer in this video, to give you a better understanding of how and why this ended up being the case. Welcome back to another episode of the Sidekicks of Science, a series in which I try to give the less accredited scientists behind some vital discoveries and theories some well-deserved acknowledgement, while simultaneously educating you, the viewer, on hopefully some new topics. Now, let's learn about Alfred Russel Wallace. As previously mentioned, Wallace was born in Llanbaddock, a village in the Usk, South Wales, not far from the birthplace of Charles Darwin, on the 8th of January 1823. He was one of 9 children born to Thomas Vere and Mary Ann Wallace, the latter of whom was from a middle-class family from Hertfordshire. Despite his mother's upbringing, Wallace grew up in a rather underprivileged environment, which was a contributing factor in his decision to not attend university, instead opting to work. His father, whilst a qualified lawyer, never practiced and made some bad financial decisions that led to the family's poor financial position. The family relocated to Hertford when Wallace was 5 years old. Wallace successfully made it through the 11+ exams and was able to gain a place at Hertford Grammar School, where he remained until he was 14, as he was not continuing on to university. Wallace then moved to London alongside his older brother John, who was then 19, with the intention of doing an apprenticeship with one of his other brothers, with the hope of becoming a surveyor. In 1837, Wallace started his apprenticeship, which lasted for a total duration of 6 years. He did the apprenticeship outside of London and so moved again. Throughout the apprenticeship, Wallace moved to various areas of mid-Wales before temporarily settling in Kington, a town in Herefordshire that was very near the Welsh border. They then moved again to Neath in South Wales, where he started work as a land surveyor of various rural areas. Wallace developed from this an interest in the wilderness and used this to flourish his skills and used this to do botany. 1843 ended up being a gruelling year for Wallace, with his father dying and him also becoming unemployed. The stint of unemployment was fairly brief, until 1844, when he was employed by a school in Leicester to teach drawing, cartography and surveying. Wallace was a heavy reader of scientific literature. One of the papers that he read was by Henry Walter Bates, whom he met by chance at some point between 1843 and 45. The two became friends, and Wallace was influenced to start collecting insects. Another loss for Wallace came in 1845, when his brother, William, who had provided Wallace with work and the apprenticeship, passed away. Wallace quit his job as a teacher and assumed himself to be the successor of William's company, which he took over with his older brother, John, who he had previously moved to London with. Success was obviously the desire, although this never really came for them. This meant that once again Wallace was left unemployed. He started work again a few months later as a civil engineer in Neath, a place that he was now very familiar with. He was once again able to spend much of his time outdoors, which he thoroughly enjoyed. In 1846, Wallace purchased a cottage in Neath with his brother John, who had by this point worked alongside him for multiple years. Alongside Henry Walter Bates, Wallace set off for the Amazon in 1848, with the plan to investigate the origin of various species. As previously mentioned, Wallace was not so stable financially, and so to fund this trip, he resorted to collecting interesting species and selling them on. The two did this for 4 years in total, with Wallace exploring the previously unexplored, being the first European naturalist to collect in some areas. By the time they were travelling home, Wallace had amassed over 1,000 animal specimens, with his favourites being birds, beetles and butterflies. On their voyage home, the pair found themselves in some trouble, with their ship catching on fire and sinking in the Atlantic. This meant that all specimens and notes were lost during the sinking, making this trip somewhat fruitless. Luckily, though, there were no casualties. By this point, however, not even a setback of this calibre would put Wallace off expeditioning. He had already caught the travel bug. Once he returned home, Wallace wrote various journals about his findings, despite having no evidence or records of them, and did so for about 2 years, before setting off on a journey to Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia and Malaysia, a region that was formerly known as the Malay Archipelago. He collected various specimens once again, over 125,000 in fact, this time for both himself and for others. He made over 5,000 new discoveries for Western scientists, which, given the length of the voyage, is rather impressive. I should also note that on a personal level, Wallace was a good person, at least by the standards of the time, acknowledging the usually uncredited in his works. It was on this trip that Wallace wrote his vital letter to Darwin that would lead to one of the most meaningful relationships in science. Oh, and of course, he penned his own theory, the Wallace line, by which he made a border-like line on the origin of species, separating the areas where species are from Asian descent and those of Oceanian descent. Wallace was a long-time fan of Darwin's, having read a large proportion of his publications. Darwin and Wallace eventually came to meet, likely through their mutual friend, the aforementioned Henry Walter Bates. Darwin desperately needed some birds to experiment on and observe, which Wallace willingly gave him. From this, their friendship spiraled, and they discussed their mutual interests and readings. In 1858, Wallace approached Darwin for some help with getting his own theory on evolution published, as he thought that it was incredibly promising. Wallace sent Darwin his work, who was shocked to find that Wallace's theory and workings were almost identical to his own, which he had formed through his trips abroad and the finches that he had brought back with him. Darwin had been incredibly secretive about his work, and this was the first time that he had really discussed it with anyone else. He had long been working on the writing of his theory behind closed doors. Following trepidation, some of Darwin's friends, namely Charles Lyell and Joseph Dalton Hooker, urged the pair to present their theory to a Linnean Society meeting. After this meeting, the pair worked on publishing their theory of evolution by natural selection, which detailed the mechanism natural selection that makes organisms that are adapted to a particular environment more likely to survive in said environment, thereby being more likely to reproduce and pass on that adapted gene. This causes species to evolve and diversify over time. That's a quick biology lesson for you there. It was only once Darwin published his On the Origin of Species the following year that the world really took notice, though. Wallace was suitably credited for his contributions by Darwin. So, why is Wallace so undercredited? Well, he's partly to blame for his own fate. Wallace had a level of what some may call imposter syndrome about him, which meant that he very often downplayed his own work and forced the credit onto Darwin. In one of his own books, he even penned the term Darwinism in the title, although it was his own work too, thus shifting the credit from the two of them onto Darwin exclusively. This had a lasting impact on people's memories and led to Wallace not being credited so much. Following the publication of the theory of evolution, Wallace continued working and did a lot more research. By the time of his death in 1913, at the age of 90 years old, Wallace had successfully published over 20 books and hundreds more essays, articles, and letters, leaving a legacy in one way or another upon thousands and thousands of people. As I'm sure you can guess, Wallace moved around many times before his passing, where he eventually ended up in Poole, where he lived with his wife Annie Mitten, whom he married in 1866. The couple had 3 children named Violet, Herbert, and William. In terms of Wallace's legacy, many nods are made to him in his birthplace, with there being a statue and numerous buildings for his namesake. This is not a patch on the legacy of Darwin, traces of whom may be found almost anywhere that he stepped foot in. Skipping back to 1889, slightly before his death, Wallace was awarded an honorary degree by the University of Oxford, an accolade that he had been offered and refused to accept on more than one occasion. Once again, this comes back to the way in which Wallace felt of himself, as though he were unworthy of such a privilege. This was due to Wallace's ties with the city, having visited on occasion. Now here's one thing I'm going to mention rather tongue-in-cheekly. Wallace is actually a part of the syllabus of the biology qualification in his birthplace of Wales, with the WJC actually acknowledging his existence as part of the curriculum. Whilst this is great, Wallace never considered to be himself Welsh, which is rather funny, so I doubt that this would exhilarate him too much. AQA, one of England's many exam boards, also take note of his work, which is great too. These are the only really noteworthy things of his legacy, unfortunately, although schools have been named in memory of him. Thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, then please remember to subscribe to this channel and like the video to increase engagement. These are the types of videos that I plan on making in the future, so stay tuned if you enjoyed. And yeah, thanks again.